The night Dara Calloway was unmade. The air smelled of pine, resin, and burnt ceremonial sage. And every wolf in the Ironwood pack stood close enough to watch, but not one voice rose to stop it. She had been standing at the edge of the stone circle for 3 minutes before she understood what was happening. The elders had called it a rite of confirmation, the words they used when a young wolf came of age and was formally recognized by her alpha as part of the pack's bonded structure. Dara had dressed carefully for it. She remembered that now, in the particular way you remember details that become unbearable afterward, the cream-coloured blouse her mother had pressed the night before. The small amber pendant her grandmother had given her on her 16th birthday, the way she had braided her dark hair back from her face so that Alpha Connell Voss could look at her clearly and say the words. She had been 22 years old, and she had wanted nothing in the world more than to belong. The Alpha looked at her clearly. He said words. They were not the words she had been waiting for. "I reject you," Connell Voss said, and his voice carried across the stone circle with the practiced ease of a man who understood acoustics, who understood theater, who had chosen this particular arrangement of 24 pack members at dusk on a Tuesday, not because the ritual required it, but because witnesses required it. "As your alpha and as your fated mate, I reject the bond between us. You are no longer of Ironwood. You carry nothing of ours with you." Dara did not fall. She remembered being surprised by that. The rejection hit her in layers, the way a bad burn hits first, the shock of heat, then the terrible knowledge of what is coming, then the pain that is so much larger than the body that contains it. The mate bond, that invisible cord she had felt singing quietly between her sternum and somewhere in the direction of Connell Voss since her 18th birthday, went silent like a snapped guitar string. Not a gradual fading, a severance. She felt it in her teeth, in the back of her skull, in the cartilage of her knuckles. She felt it in a place that had no anatomical name, the place where wolves keep the certainty that they are not alone in the world. 24 pairs of eyes watched. Not one moved toward her. She stood in the stone circle in her cream-colored blouse and her grandmother's amber pendant, and she breathed, and she did not ask him why, because she already knew the answer would not be one she could use. Connell Voss did not look at her after the first sentence. He turned back toward the pack tree line before she had finished processing what his mouth had said, and the other wolves turned with him, not dramatically, not in unison, but in the particular slow rotation of people who have been given permission to stop caring about something and who are relieved to exercise it. Dara walked out of the Ironwood territory that night carrying $43 in cash, a change of clothes, and the amber pendant, which she refused to leave behind on principle. The pine trees released her without ceremony. The moon, 3/4 full and the color of old bone, gave her enough light to find the road. She did not look back. That was the first independent decision she made as a woman with no pack. It would not be the last. 7 years was a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that forms around a wound that has been properly, professionally tended, not healed exactly, but sealed and hardened, and made useful in the way that scar tissue is useful, tougher than what it replaced, more resistant to damage, entirely without the original softness, and not mourning it. 7 years was enough time to learn what she was without Ironwood, to discover that the thing Connell Voss had looked at and found wanting was not, in fact, the sum of her. She found out what she was in stages, the way you find a room in a house you thought you knew completely, first the door, then the smell of a different air. Then the realization that the room had been there all along and the house had simply not introduced you yet. The first stage was the Ashford Pack in the borderlands of northern Oregon, a small coalition of wolves who ran without a formal alpha structure, who were more interested in survival than hierarchy, who took in strays with the pragmatic generosity of people who understood that strays were often the most talented members of any disbanded group. Dara arrived in November, thin and magnetic in the way of someone who has been running hard and has learned to enjoy it. She stayed through 3 winters. She learned to track in the particular mud of that region, to read weather systems by the pressure behind her sinuses, to negotiate with territorial river spirits who did not respect pack hierarchy because they predated it. She learned to lead small raids for supplies, without violence. She learned that her voice, when she chose to use it with the particular frequency she had discovered in herself the 3rd month of her exile, made large male wolves take a reflexive step backward, and then look confused about why they had done so. She did not call it power. She called it competence, because she was still, at that stage, translating everything she was into terms that did not require her to revise what Connell Voss had decided about her. That revision took longer. It required the second stage. The second stage was the Duskfall Pack, 300 miles south, and specifically the alpha of it, Leandro Mace, who was not fated to her in any way the mate bond recognized, but who saw her demonstrate that frequency in a territorial dispute with the Ashford Wolves' river spirits, and offered her a seat at his council table that same night. He was 6'3" and built like a question someone had asked very seriously, and his eyes were the particular amber that certain timber wolves carry in low light, and he did not look at her the way Connell Voss had looked at her, which is to say, he did not look through her. He looked at her the way you look at a problem you find genuinely interesting. "What are you doing all the way out here?" he asked, and the question was not about geography. "Learning what I'm made of," she said, which was also not about geography. Leandro Mace had built the Duskfall Pack from a coalition of 8 packs that had lost their alpha structures within a 3-year period, most of them to the territorial war. The northern packs called the Red Winter, and the southern packs called something in a language older than English, that translated roughly as the time of institutional failures. He was 34 years old, and had been an alpha for 6 of those years, and he held the coalitions together by being, fundamentally, better at understanding power than anyone who opposed him. He understood that power was not the ability to make people afraid. It was the ability to make them feel that belonging to you was worth more than belonging to themselves, and to be correct about that. He was usually correct. He offered Dara a seat at his council table. 3 months later, he asked her to take the position of his second. 6 months after that, the bond between them, not the mate bond, something different, something she did not have a word for, but that felt like 2 rivers deciding to run parallel, was visible to every wolf in the Duskfall territory. They felt it. They talked about it. They made space for it. The way you make space for something you can tell is structural. Leandro did not perform the question. He asked her one evening while they were running the western boundary, both of them in half shift. The sky, over the Oregon coast, the particular bruised purple that comes in the hour after a specific kind of storm has passed. "Be my Luna," he said, and it was not a demand, and it was not a plea, and it was not a negotiation. It was a statement about what he had already decided she was, offered to her for confirmation. She was quiet for a long time. The ocean made it sound below them. She had not planned to be anyone's Luna. She had planned, in the careful, methodical way of someone who has been hurt by the failure to plan, to simply become so entirely her own that no rejection could reach her. She had nearly succeeded. The question was whether nearly was enough, and whether the thing Leandro Mace was asking her to become was the same as what Connell Voss had decided she could not be. She decided it was not the same. She decided, specifically, that the version of herself standing on that coastal ridge in half-shift with 7 years of scar tissue and a voice that moved large wolves without her trying was a different calculation than the 22-year-old in. The cream blouse who had wanted nothing more than to belong to something that was already deciding she couldn't. "Yes," she said, and the word sat in the coastal air without apology. The news traveled the way. News in the wolf world always travels faster than it should, and with details no one can account for. Within a month, the Duskfall coalition of 8 former packs and approximately 260 wolves knew that Leandro Mace had taken a Luna, and that she was the former Ironwood exile, and that her name was Dara Calloway Mace now, and that she was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of person you would feel relieved to be judged by. The councils of the neighboring packs knew. The river spirits knew, because river spirits are not discreet about things they consider important, and they had considered Dara Calloway important since the Ashford years. Connell Voss knew by the end of the month. Dara knew he knew because one of the Duskfall Council's informants in the Northern Territories confirmed it, and because 3 days after the confirmation she received a letter at the Duskfall compound handwritten, on ironwood letterhead, in a script she recognized requesting a formal diplomatic meeting between the Ironwood Pact leadership and the Duskfall coalition. The letter made no reference to her name. It addressed itself only to the Duskfall Alpha. It was, she thought, the most Connell Voss thing she had ever read. She brought it to Leandro and set it on his desk and watched him read it. His expression did not change, because Leandro Mace's expression almost never changed at the speed of new information. It changed later. Privately, after he had decided what the information meant. He read the letter twice. He set it down. "Tell me what you need," he said, because that was how Leandro operated. Not assumptions, not strategy without consent, not decisions made around her. What she needed was complex, and she had learned, in the Ashford years and the early Duskfall years, to translate complexity into operational clarity before speaking. She needed to be in the room. She needed to look at Conal Voss across a table and have him understand the full distance between who she had been at 22 and who she was now, without her performing it for him, just the fact of her presence. Her title, her position beside Leandro, allowed to speak for itself. She needed, specifically, not to forgive him, because forgiveness was something she had examined from multiple angles across 7 years, and had decided was a commodity she was not required to distribute to everyone who had, eventually, been inconvenienced by their own choices. "I need to be in the meeting," she said. "At the table, not as a courtesy inclusion, and I need you not to tell him in advance that I'm coming." Leandro considered this for 3 seconds. "Done," he said. They drove north 4 weeks later, a duskfall convoy of 3 vehicles on roads Dara had walked the edge of in the dark, carrying $43 in cash. The countryside looked different from inside a convoy. It looked like territory rather than escape route. She noted the difference and filed it in the category of things she was still discovering about what she had become. She wore grey. She wore it deliberately, not the ceremonial colours she might have chosen to signal status, not the warmer tones she preferred personally, but the flat, specific grey of a person who has made a decision and does not need anyone else's reaction to the decision in order to feel certain about it. The amber pendant was at her throat, because she had decided in the first week of her exile that if she was going to insist on keeping anything from before, she was going to insist on keeping it visibly. The ironwood compound looked smaller than she remembered. This was a fact she had been told to expect. Returned places are always smaller. The architecture of memory inflates what frightened us, but the actual experience of it was still specific and strange. Like running your tongue over the space where a tooth had been, and finding the gap less dramatic than the original absence had suggested. The stone circle was visible from the main approach, set back from the lodge among old-growth pine. She looked at it once, catalogued what she felt, which was less than she expected and more precise, and then looked away. The meeting was in the Ironwood main hall, a long room with exposed timber rafters and a table that could seat 30. Conal Voss had arranged it for 12, 6 Ironwood representatives and, as the letter had specified, the Duskfall Alpha and 5 of his council members. The chairs were already set when the Duskfall convoy arrived. Conal Voss was standing at the far end of the room with 3 of his senior wolves, talking in the low, efficient register of someone conducting the last stage of preparation. He heard the convoy. He turned when the main hall door opened. Dara walked in third, because third was the position that made the most sense spatially. Leandro first, his security lead second, then her, then 3 council members behind. This was not theatre. It was practical logistics. The fact that it meant Conal Voss had 2 seconds to register Leandro, 2 seconds to register the security lead, and then arrived at her face in the manner of someone whose internal processing had just been handed a problem it had not prepared for. That was not something she had planned, exactly. It was something she had allowed for. She watched his face. She allowed herself that. What moved across Conal Voss's face was complicated and fast, and she catalogued it with the same precision she applied to territorial weather systems. First, recognition. Then the specific, involuntary response of someone encountering a mate bond that has been formally severed but that the body still attempts to complete a microflinch, a slight parting of the lips, a breath taken slightly earlier than intended. Then something that she could only describe as recalibration, the visible adjustment of a person who has been holding a certain story about a situation and has just been handed evidence that the story has significant gaps. Then he looked at the pendant. She saw exactly when his eyes found it. She did not give him time to arrange his expression into anything diplomatic. She walked to the table and took her seat at Leandro's right hand, which was her seat, which had been her seat for 2 years. and she opened the folio she had brought, and she looked at Connell Voss with the particular quality of attention that had nothing in it except professional interest in whatever he was about to say. "Alpha Mace," Connell Voss said, and his voice was steady. Credit where due, his voice was entirely steady. "Thank you for making the drive." "My Luna arranged the logistics," Leandro said, without looking up from his own notes. "She knows this territory better than I do." The silence after that sentence had a texture. Dara felt the 6 Ironwood representatives receive it. She watched 2 of them look at her and then look away. She recognized both of them, Petra Holst, who had been 3 years ahead of her in pack training and had been one of the 24 who watched the stone circle without speaking, and Marcus Webb, who had been Connell's second for as long as Dara could remember, and who was currently examining his notepad with extreme focus. The meeting was about territorial adjustment along the northern border, where Ironwood's boundary met the edge of what was now technically Duskfall Coalition territory. Following the absorption of the Lakeran Pack the previous year, it was a legitimate diplomatic matter. Connell Voss presented the Ironwood position in the measured, thorough way of someone who was good at his job. His position was not unreasonable. Dara had reviewed the boundary surveys herself and had, in fact, suggested 3 of the compromise points that Leandro had brought as Duskfall's counter-proposal. She spoke twice. The first time was to correct a survey reference that Connell had cited from a map that had been superseded by the Lakerun integration surveys she had personally reviewed. She did it quietly, with the citation number and the page, and she put the corrected document on the table where everyone could see it, and she did not editorialize. The second time was to address a proposed boundary marker that would have been technically valid under the old territorial agreements, but that sat on ground she knew from the Ashford years. From learning to negotiate with river spirits was considered liminal by the water entities that ran under that hillside, and whose cooperation was not optional for anyone who wanted stable pack operations within 4 miles of that location. She explained this. She cited 2 precedents from coalition records. She suggested an alternative marker site. Both times she spoke, Connell Voss looked at her. Not the way he had looked at her in the stone circle, not the looking through. The other way. The way she did not have a name for, except that it was the way a person looks when they are revising something they have said out loud and cannot now unsay. She did not soften the second time. She did not soften at any point. This was not cruelty. It was precision. The meeting lasted 4 hours. The boundary agreement was substantially reached. A formal signing would happen at a neutral site within 60 days. There was a break at the 2-hour mark for coffee and the careful, structured informality of diplomatic courtesy. Dara stood near the window with her coffee and looked at the tree line and was aware of Connell Voss moving toward her with the deliberate, controlled gait of a man who has decided to do something he knows will cost him something. He stopped at a distance she would have considered respectful if she had been feeling generous about it. "Dara," he said. "Alpha Voss," she said, because titles were not about formality in that moment. They were about the exact shape of the distance she intended to maintain. He took that. She watched him take it the way you watch someone take a step onto ground they are not sure about, and find that it holds, but does not offer the traction they need. "I wanted to say," he started. "The boundary proposal for the northern marker is the best outcome available to both territories," she said. "I'd encourage your council to ratify it without amendment. The river spirits along that line have a long memory, and they don't respond well to documentation that contradicts their prior agreements. If you want detailed notes on how to approach that conversation, I can have them couriered before the formal signing." She watched him understand that she had just answered a question he had not asked, in place of the question he had, and that she had done it with such operational precision that there was no available move that didn't either confirm her direction of travel or require him to be explicit about what he actually wanted to say. She watched him understand that she had done this on purpose. "That would be helpful," he said, after a pause that lasted almost as long as the original rejection had taken to land. "Thank you." "You're welcome," she said, and turned back to the window. She heard him walk away. She heard the exact number of steps before he rejoined his council, and she let out a breath that was not relief. She was careful about that. Careful to name it correctly, but that was something more like the final release of a grip that she had been maintaining for 7 years, not because she needed it anymore, but because she hadn't yet found the right moment to open. Her hand. Not forgiveness. Something simpler than that. The decision that she was done carrying the weight of his error, along with her own history. The duskfall convoy left the Ironwood compound at dusk. The three vehicles pulling out of the pine-shadowed drive with the particular efficiency of an organization that had made a successful diplomatic run and had nothing to prove by lingering. Dara sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle beside Leandro, who was driving because he preferred to drive when he was thinking. The forest came down on either side of the road. The sky above the tree line was the color of iron and old roses. Leandro drove for 11 minutes without speaking, which was how she knew he was thinking about something real rather than something operational. "How are you?" he said, finally. She considered the question with the same honesty she tried to bring to all of his questions, because he asked them honestly and they were worth it. She was not the 22-year-old in the cream blouse. She was not the exile with $43 in cash. She was not even the woman who had stood on the coastal ridge and said yes with the ocean making it sound below them, though that woman was closer to who she was now than any prior version. She was someone who had walked into a room where she had once been unmade, and had spoken twice from documented evidence, and had looked at the man who had done the unmaking, and had felt the precise and limited grief of a thing that is finished, rather than the open wound of a thing that is still asking questions. "I'm good," she said, and it was the truth. And it was a specific kind of truth, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something that had been built out of difficulty and that held. Leandro nodded. He drove. The pine forest gave way to the coastal range, and the coastal range gave way to the long, salt-tanged approach to Duskfall territory, and Dara watched the landscape change the way she had learned to watch everything. With full attention, with the knowledge that the details mattered and that you could not go back and see them again once they had passed. The amber pendant was warm against her throat. But she needed, still, to say what had happened accurately, and this required going back inside the 4 hours of the meeting and looking at what she had not let herself examine during it. Because there had been a moment she had noted it at the time with the part of her that tracked everything and processed it later, when Connell Voss had looked at her across the table while she was speaking the second time, while she was laying out the river spirit precedents with the calm authority of someone who had spent years building that authority out of raw experience and pure necessity, and his face had done a thing that was not recalibration, and was not social management, and was not the controlled expression of an alpha in a diplomatic setting. His face had done the thing faces do when a person understands, in a way that cannot be undone, that they were wrong, and that the wrongness was not abstract but specific, and had a cost that had been paid by someone else. She had seen that. She had filed it. And now, in the passenger seat with the forest releasing them toward the coast, she opened the file and looked at it. It did not move her toward him. That was the part she needed to be precise about. It was possible to see another person's understanding of their own wrongness, and to feel something not warmth exactly, but the particular human response to witnessing the moment someone becomes, in some small increment, less defended than they were, and to feel that while also understanding with complete clarity that the understanding changed nothing about what she was going to do, which was to continue being exactly who she was, in the place she had built, with the person who had looked at her problem as something interesting rather than something inconvenient. She had not come to that meeting for Connell Voss. She had come because she needed to be in the room. Because the room was, in some essential way, part of the territory of her own history, and she was done leaving sections of her own territory unwalked. Done leaving the stone circle as a wound that required avoidance rather than a place she had passed through on the way to somewhere else. She had walked back into it not to be witnessed by him, but to witness herself, to see what she was in the place where she had been told she was nothing, and to find that she was, by any reasonable measurement, substantially more than nothing, and to let that finding be a fact rather than a victory, because she was done needing victories over Connell Voss. She had been done with that for longer than she had allowed herself to admit. The Duskfall compound came into view around a bend, the cluster of buildings set in the hills above the coast, lights coming on in the long evening in ones and twos, the pack returning from afternoon runs, the kitchen staff visible through the long windows of the main hall, preparing the evening meal. She had come to know this place the way you come to know something that has become genuinely yours, not because you claimed it aggressively, but because it has asked things of you and you have given them, and the exchange has been honest. Leandro pulled into the compound and cut the engine, and the other two convoy vehicles pulled in behind them, and the quiet of the Oregon coast settled in, salt-edged, with the sound of the ocean 3 miles west making its permanent low argument with the land. "The council is going to want a debrief tonight," Leandro said. "I know," she said. "I'll have the survey corrections and the river spirit notes ready before the meeting. An hour." He looked at her then. Not the diplomat's look and not the alpha's look. The specific look he had that she had come to recognize as the one he kept for moments of genuine regard, the look that had nothing calculated in it. "Dara," he said. "Leandro," she said. "You know what I'm going to say. You're going to say that you're glad I went in." "I'm going to say that I'm glad you went in," he confirmed, "and that whatever you carried out of there, you look like you put it down somewhere." She thought about the way Connell Voss's face had looked in the moment of understanding, and the way she had looked at it from the other side of 7 years of scar tissue, and had felt the grief of a finished thing rather than an unfinished one. She thought about the stone circle visible from the compound drive, and the way she had looked at it once and then looked away, and how the away was now a different kind of away, not avoidance, but simply direction. The direction of where she was going, rather than the direction of what she was leaving. "I put it down," she said. They walked into the compound together, and the duskfall pack moved around them with the ease of a body moving around its own center of gravity, the natural, unremarkable orientation of a community toward the two people who held its direction and its care. And Dara felt it the way she had learned to feel it, not with the desperate relief of someone who had once needed to belong and had been refused, but with the steady, well-made satisfaction of someone who understood the difference between belonging that was given and belonging that was built. She spent the following 3 days writing the report. It was thorough and exact, and it included the river spirit precedents in an appendix and the corrected survey citations in a second appendix, and a 2-page section on her read of the Ironwood Pack's actual diplomatic priorities versus their stated ones, which she had arrived at by watching the faces of the 6 Ironwood representatives across the 4 hours of the meeting, and noting specifically when their expressions sharpened or softened in relation to particular proposals. She had always been good at reading rooms. Connell Voss had rejected her for reasons she had spent a long time trying to locate, and had eventually concluded were probably not one thing, probably a combination of political pressure, the specific insecurities of a young alpha consolidating power, and the particular failure mode of people who are handed something they were not ready for and respond by refusing it before it can refuse them. She had stopped needing the reason to be simple. The reason was probably not simple. The consequence, however, had been extremely clear. $43 in cash, and the dark pine road, and the bone-colored moon, and 7 years. She had used all of it. Petra Holst reached out 2 weeks after the meeting, through the formal dusk-fall correspondence channels, requesting a private consultation. The subject line of the correspondence read, "Resource Coordination Northern Territory," which was, Dara thought, the most Ironwood way to phrase what was almost certainly also a personal inquiry. She considered the request for 1 day and then authorized the consultation because the resource coordination element was genuine. Petra was Ironwood's new territorial liaison, appointed after the boundary agreement framework, and there were actual logistical questions that needed an actual conversation. She met Petra at a neutral site, a small diner on the highway midway between the territories, because this was not a compound conversation. It was a highway conversation, the kind that happens between two people who are figuring out how much of the past to put on the table alongside the professional matter they have agreed to discuss. Petra was 52 now, slim and sharp-eyed, with the kind of face that had made decisions and showed it. She sat across from Dara in a booth with laminate tables and the specific decor of a place that had been trying to be charming for 40 years and had committed to the attempt. And for the first several minutes they discussed the northern boundary logistics, with the focused efficiency of two people who had both, in their different ways, become very competent. Then Petra set down her coffee cup and looked at Dara directly. "I want to say that I was there," she said, "at the circle. I want to say that I have thought about it a significant number of times since." Dara held the statement for a moment. It was not an apology. Exactly, it was the piece before an apology. The piece where the person establishes the nature of their own debt before asking what denomination the other person will accept. She recognized the structure because she had used it herself in situations where she had done something she couldn't undo and needed to begin the accounting from a place of accurate acknowledgement. "I know you were there," Dara said. "I was afraid of Connell," Petra said. She stopped. "That's not a justification. I know that." "No," Dara said, "but it's probably true." "It is true." "Okay," Dara said. She looked at the laminate table and then back at Petra. "I'm not going to tell you it was all right. It wasn't all right. 24 people watched something be done to me that wasn't right, and none of you moved, and I walked out of there into 7 years of a lot of different things. Some of them were good things, eventually. Most of them were hard. That's what I carried, and I'm not going to rewrite it as less than it was because it's easier in this booth." Petra received this without deflecting. "No," she said. "I wouldn't ask you to. But I'm also not going to carry your portion of it for you," Dara said. "That was something I figured out somewhere around year 4. I had enough of my own weight. I don't need yours too. So whatever you're working out about what you did or didn't do, that's yours to work out. I'm not your absolution." Petra looked at her for a long moment with the specific look of someone receiving something difficult and finding it, against expectation, more useful than comfort would have been. "All right," she said. "The northern boundary liaison work is a good opportunity," Dara said, moving them back. "The river spirit relationships in that corridor are going to be the actual variable in long-term stability. If you want, I can share the Ashford protocols. They're not formally documented anywhere. I have them in personal notes. They'd give you a significant advantage in those negotiations." Petra blinked. "You'd share that?" "It benefits both territories, and the spirits don't care which pack they're working with as long as the protocols are respected," Dara said. "I'll send them after we file the formal coordination agreement." They finished their coffee. They drove away in different directions. Dara thought about the conversation on the highway back to Duskfall, picking at its edges, checking what she felt about it, the way she habitually checked the structural integrity of things she had decided. What she found was that it was solid. She had not softened. She had not performed magnanimity. She didn't feel. She had given Petra the accurate accounting without dramatizing it, and had declined the role of the person who releases everyone else from the weight of what they did, not out of bitterness, but out of the specific self-knowledge of a woman who understood the difference between generosity and the habitual minimization of her own experience, and had chosen generosity only where she actually had it to give, and minimization nowhere. This was one of the things she had built in 7 years. It was not the most dramatic thing. It was, she thought, possibly the most important. The formal boundary signing happened in the neutral territory, at a site that had been agreed on because it was equidistant from both compounds and had no historical significance to either pack, which meant no one was being asked to receive the other in a position of disadvantage. It was a field on the edge of a managed forest, a rented meeting facility with a long room and practical furniture, the kind of neutral ground that smelled of other people's negotiations. Connell Voss arrived with 4 of his senior council. Dara arrived with Leandro and the Duskfall Council's formal delegation. The document was 12 pages of territorial language, reviewed and initialed through 42 days of careful back and forth, and its signing was primarily a formality. At that point, the substance had been agreed. But formalities in the wolf world carried their own weight, their own significance, because they were the moments when what had been privately negotiated became publicly structured. And public structure was what made things real in a way that private agreements, however sincere, were not. Dara signed the document on behalf of the Duskfall Coalition in her capacity as Luna, an acting council chair for territorial affairs, which was the title she had held for 18 months and that had been confirmed by vote of the full coalition council rather than assigned by Leandro's authority alone, because she had insisted on that and Leandro had agreed it was right. Her signature was her married name and it was legible, and it went on the line where it was supposed to go, and she did not look up from the document while she was signing it. When she did look up, Connell Voss was watching her, not with the recalibration she had seen in the Ironwood Hall, and not with the social management of the diplomatic professional, but with something quieter and more settled, the expression, she thought, of a person who has finished a particular argument with themselves and arrived somewhere not comfortable but honest. She met his eyes for 3 seconds, exactly 3 seconds, because she was precise about these things. Then she capped her pen and handed the document to the notary and turned to Leandro to review the implementation timeline. Because the implementation timeline was the next thing, and she was someone who always moved to the next thing. The formal part of the signing took 40 minutes. There was a brief reception afterward, because these were wolves, and wolves understood the function of communal food and drink in the architecture of agreements, not celebration exactly, but the physical acknowledgement that something has been resolved. Dara drank mineral water and spoke with 3 different people from the Ironwood contingent about practical logistics, and said nothing that was not professionally useful and was, throughout, entirely present in the way she had learned to be present, fully here, no significant portion of her attention running backward or sideways into old territory. Connell Voss crossed the room toward her once. She watched him approach in her peripheral vision. He stopped at the edge of conversational distance and said, "The river spirit notes you sent were thorough." "They were accurate," she said. "Petra said as much." He said, "She's been implementing them. The water entities in the northern corridor have been cooperative is probably the right word, where they weren't before." "Good," she said. A pause. The reception moved around them with the mild, slightly formal energy of people in the later stages of an official event who are beginning to think about driving home. "I owe you an apology that I don't know how to give in any form that's adequate," Connell Voss said. He said it quietly, without the theatrical weight of a performance, without the managed tone of an alpha giving a counsel statement. He said it the way a person says something true that they have been running from for long enough that the running has worn them out. She listened to it. She let it land, because she was not someone who reflexively deflected things before she knew what they were. "I know," she said. "I was wrong," he said, "about what I thought you were, about what I was doing, about," he paused, "about what I cost you." "Yes," she said. He waited. She could feel him waiting for the thing that people wait for in these moments, the release, the absolution, the woman saying it's all right, the wound declaring itself healed, and the person who made it permitted to put it down. She thought about what she had told Petra in the diner on the highway. She thought about year 4 and the specific accounting she had done, and the decision she had made about whose weight was whose. She thought about the amber pendant and the $43 and the bone-colored moon on the pine road and all 24 pairs of eyes in the stone circle and the 3 winters in Ashford and the river spirits, the coastal ridge and 7 years of building something out of what had been broken. And she thought about Leandro driving with his hands easy on the wheel and asking how she was and meaning it. "I know," she said again. "And I hope you're figuring out how to live with it, because that's yours to do, and I think you'll do it better than you think. But I'm not the person who gets to release you from it. That's not something I have to give." Connell Voss received this in the way she had come to expect from him in this new configuration, not with deflection, but with the stillness of someone absorbing something accurately. He nodded. "Once, and precisely." "All right," he said. "Take care of your pack," she said, because she meant it. Because she was not his enemy, and she was not his punisher, and she was not the story of what he had done to her. She was someone who had left his territory and built something real, and was now standing in a neutral field, signing documents that would create better conditions for both their communities. And that was, in its way, the final shape of what she was in relation to him. Not victim, not supplicant. Not the rejected mate returned to prove a point, but a peer with a different territory who expected him to govern his will. He left. She turned back to the room. Later, in the car, Leandro said, "He spoke to you." "He apologized," she said. Leandro said nothing for a moment. The highway unrolled ahead of them, dark between its verges, the stars sharp over the coastal range. "What did you say?" he said. "I told him it was his to carry," she said, "and that I hoped he'd carry it honestly." Leandro drove. The amber pendant caught the light of a passing truck and held it for a moment, bright as something found. "Good," he said. She watched the road. She watched the stars over the coastal range and the dark shapes of the trees against them, and the long, open quality of the highway at night that had once been an escape route, and was now simply the road between where she had been and where she lived, and the distinction mattered, and she held it. The Duskfall Coalition began the boundary implementation 6 days after the signing, and it went smoothly because Dara had planned it to go smoothly, and because the river spirits in the northern corridor were cooperative, and because Petra Holst turned out to be exactly as competent as Dara had assessed her to be, and because the two of them developed. Over the following months, a working relationship that was not friendship, but was the thing adjacent to it, the professional trust of two people who have decided to treat each other with the accuracy they both deserve, which is sometimes more durable than the emotional kind. 3 months after the signing, the Lakerin integration was finalized, and the Duskfall Coalition grew to encompass 11 former packs and approximately 330 wolves, and the Council voted to formally ratify the Coalition's governance structure as a permanent model rather than a transitional arrangement, which had been in question since the early days. Dara presented the ratification proposal, and the Council voted it through 11-0. She came home from the council meeting, and Leandro was in the kitchen of the main lodge, which he used in the evenings when the administrative day was over. And he had made the particular kind of meal he made when something had been resolved, something slow-cooked and uncomplicated, and filling in the way of things that do not need to announce themselves. She sat at the kitchen table, and he put a plate in front of her and sat across from her, and the window behind him showed the dark coast and the stars. And she was not the 22-year-old in the cream blouse. She was not the exile with the bone-colored moon. She was not the woman on the coastal ridge making her careful decision about what to become. She was the Luna of the Duskfall Coalition on the Oregon coast, with her hands around a warm plate and the amber pendant at her throat, and 11 packs behind her, and the vote of 330 wolves in the permanent record, and she was hungry, and she was home. She ate, and she did not need the room to witness it, and she did not need Connell Voss to understand the distance, and she did not need anyone's apology to know the full, earned, unambiguous weight of what she had made, of what had been done to her. And she needed none of it, not the validation or the recognition or the completed accounting, because she had built something that stood on its own, and it was hers, and it held.